Around 1905, Lottie Ki Yated, daughter of a Laguna Pueblo chief, posed for a photograph. The Kawaii attire with beaded belt and necklaces signals the ceremonial role. The scene takes place in the semi-arid west-central region of New Mexico, on the outskirts of Albuquerque, as the railroads were beginning to connect regions, goods, and ways of life. Yellow Dog, a member of the Crow, Apsaluk people, photographed by F.J. Haynes and Brothers in 1889, during the transition from the plains to the reservations. The photograph circulated as an ethnographic record and documentation of Indigenous leadership, forming part of Haynes's commercial series on the peoples of the Great Plains in the northern United States. Beulah Tahamont lived during a time when Native peoples in North America faced assimilation policies, loss of land, and boarding schools. Born into a context of resistance and preservation, she was Abenaki and Oneida. Her name appears in records around 1907, when leaders and families were working to keep their language, ceremonies, and ways of making a living under government pressure. Lucy Red Cloud, a Sioux woman, photographed in 1898 by Frank A. Reinhardt. The photograph is part of the series made at the Indian Congress of the Trans-Mississippi Exposition in Omaha, dedicated to recording Native American delegations. The portrait documents garments, adornments, and ceremonial posture associated with the Lakota, preserving the memory of leaders and families. In 1908, a photo attributed to Roland Reed records an Ojibwe woman. At the turn of the century, her people inhabited the Great Lakes region, moving with the rhythm of the seasons, fishing, gathering, and crafts in birch bark and beadwork. The image suggests continuity of knowledge and, at the same time, an encounter with photographic modernity. Subscribe and tell us where you're joining us from. In the early 1900s, during the gold rush, Valdez, a port on the Gulf of Alaska, served as a gateway for mining routes and heavy traffic of people and cargo. In 1907, the local photo studio captured the daughter of Chief Nikolai of the Atna people, highlighting Native presence amid the region's rapid economic change. Portrait of Bird Wild Hog, also called Hedgehog and Snake Whistle, a member of the Cheyenne people. Made in Montana, 1892, at the end of the era of the American Indian Wars, when reservations and assimilation policies were being consolidated. Author Christian Barthelmess, a military photographer who documented Indigenous life in the garrisons of the plains. In 1900, Carl Wernz photographs in Arizona, two young Hopi by a window. The hair whirls signal youth and roles in the community. At the turn of the century, the villages atop the mesas of the Colorado Plateau received artists, traders, and travelers. Their gazes already follow this approaching world, bringing promises and tensions. In 1909, a photographer documented members of the Crow Nation in Montana at the Crow Agency. As the administrative center of the reservation, the agency managed supply distribution, enforced federal policies, and handled negotiations with government agents. It was also a place for ceremonies and gatherings that carried on the community's cultural traditions. Blackfeet Camp in Montana, early 20th century. Tippis arranged in a circle and horses grazing, the basis of mobility and regional exchange. The scene, recorded on a glass magic lantern slide by Walter McClintock, documents everyday practices and the group's adaptation to the new conditions imposed by reservations and markets. Around 1905. In 1878, a photograph at Fort Keogh in the Montana Territory shows a Cheyenne woman. The military post, erected after Little Bighorn under Nelson Miles's campaign, consolidated the army on the plains. In that environment, the Cheyenne, an Algonquian-speaking people and allies of the Lakota and Arapaho, experienced displacement and struggled to preserve their rights and memory. In 1920, in the city of Lawton, Oklahoma, photographer Bates captured a Comanche mother and her child. Taken during a time of federal assimilation policies, the photo shows members of a southwestern tribe connected to Fort Sill. The portrait stands as a historic record, preserving clothing, posture, and family bonds central to Comanche life. In the image, Carlotta Chiwiwi appears with her daughters, Maria and Felicita Tura, members of Taos Pueblo. The record from the early 20th century and attributed to Poli is set in the U.S. Southwest, when New Mexico was moving from territory to statehood in 1912. The composition reinforces kinship ties and the centrality of women in Taiwa life. In 1958, Blackfoot woman Joyce McDougall was photographed in the community of Brockett, the headquarters of the Pawnee Nation on the Pagan Reserve in southern Alberta, Canada. The photo marks a period when reserves, shaped by federal policies, organized life on the plains. Among the prairie peoples, the Blackfoot maintained their language and rituals despite pressure from schools and religious institutions. Apsaluk Group, Crow Nation, portrayed in the early 20th century in the Montana region, possibly on the Crow Reservation. The image, recorded by N.A. Forsyth, documents clothing, mounts, and social arrangements during the 1900-1915 transition, marked by federal agencies and assimilation schools. It circulated on postcards and in regional collections. The Parting, 1908, a photograph by Roland W. Reed, records Ojibwe members at a moment of farewell in the early 20th century. Produced in the Great Lakes setting, the image combines documentation and staging, typical of Reed, and preserves garments, canoes, and ritual gestures, reflecting tensions between indigenous traditions and assimilation policies in the United States. At First Mesa, Arizona, Frederick Monson recorded in the first decades of the 20th century, young Hopi from Sikomovi. The girls wear ritual attire tied to the rhythm of harvests and village festivals. Amid a Southwest in transformation, the photograph reveals practices that hold firm and weave cultural continuity. Between past and future, the portrait brings us closer. In 1923, a photograph taken in Havre, Montana, near the Canadian border, shows Jim Denny of the Cree Nation with his wife Maggie, daughter of Little Bear, and their children William and Florence. The image captures a native family in the early 20th century, a time when Cree people lived across areas of what are now the United States and Canada. Blackfeet women, early 20th century Montana. Photographed by N.A. Forsyth in a period of consolidation of reservations and assimilation policies in the United States. Clothing combines traditional elements and trade items. The image records women's roles in the economy, ritual life, and the transmission of knowledge during the transition to life on reservations. A scene from 1895 portrays a young woman of Taos Pueblo, in present-day New Mexico. Among adobe walls, marks of daily labor dialogue with the memory of the place, inhabited for centuries by Taiwa speakers. On the upper Rio Grande, the Pueblo was a crossroads of exchange before colonization. The multi-story dwellings reveal the communal logic of its architecture. In 1908, the photograph titled "Near the End of a Noble Life" recorded the final years of Chief Louison, a Salish, Flathead leader. The image reflects a time of forced transition, when native communities in the northwestern United States faced assimilation policies, but continued to preserve their practices, languages, and ties to the land. Record of the first gun club in La Junta, Colorado, c. 1900. The club brought together residents and railroad employees for marksmanship training, seasonal hunting, and local competitions, practices common in the West at that time. It also served as a space of male sociability and civic discipline, aligned with the safety norms then promoted. In 1892, the photograph records a young Kiowa in an everyday scene, integrated with her people. The garments, made with beads and textiles already common in that period, signal exchanges with settlers and the plains trade networks. The attentive gaze and the adornments suggest the responsibilities of youth and rights that sustained Kiowa life at the end of the 19th century. In the early decades of the 20th century, a photographer in Montana captured the careful preparation of members of the Flathead Nation for a ritual dance. The clothing, instruments, and steps were organized according to ceremonial calendars, showing how sacred dances were passed down across generations and how central they were to social and spiritual life. Montana, early 20th century. The record titled A Ride in the White Man's Stink Wagon describes the first contact of indigenous people and settlers with the gasoline automobile, called the stink wagon. The narrative, common in newspapers and local memoirs, shows curiosity, fear, and the rapid insertion of the machine into the state's rural roots. A Woman of the Spokane Nation, recorded in 1897 by Frank LaRoche, faces the camera. The clothing and adornments point to practices of the Columbia Plateau. The scene belongs to a time of turning in the Pacific Northwest. Railroads were advancing and new economies taking hold, while collective life preserved rituals, beadwork, and basketry. In 1925, on the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana, Mary Henry Gunn, Mrs. Alec Gardepee, and Mrs. Jane, Pecuni women, were photographed studying reading. The scene reflects literacy efforts tied to assimilation policies and the reservation school, marking the negotiation between Blackfeet oral tradition and the administrative demands of the state. Keogh, also known as Lati or Lata'atsi, is cited in a record from the Pueblo of Laguna, in what was then the territory of New Mexico, around 1904. The notation combines Anglophone spellings of the indigenous name. The document, likely photographic or ethnographic in origin, places the person in the Laguna community during the early 20th century. In 1904, in present-day New Mexico, a photograph records the Corn Maiden, a mythical figure of the Pueblo peoples. At the turn of the 20th century, the scene reveals corn as the axis of daily life, sustenance at the table, ruler of the agricultural calendar, and offering in rituals. By bringing myth, labor, and community together, the image shows how the Southwest wove meaning around this grain. In 1904, at the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis, Belle Johnson was present. From the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana, she was of mixed heritage, Pecuni Blackfeet and Swedish. Her presence recorded the meeting of Native and European traditions and highlighted before a national audience the importance of Native representation at major events. Left Hand Bear, a member of the Oglala Lakota, portrayed in 1899 by the Hain Photo Studio. Studio portraits from the late 19th century documented indigenous presence after the wars and the consolidation of reservations, serving as visual testimony to identities under federal policies. Such images circulated in albums and exhibitions, shaping public perception. In 1900, Carl Everton Moon traveled through indigenous territories in the United States to record, with the camera, a world in transformation. His project documented daily practices, rituals, landscapes, and elders' accounts, seeking to keep memory at the turn of the 20th century, when Western expansion and new frontiers were redrawing these communities' lives. At the beginning of the 20th century in Montana, a photograph captured Chief Rocky Boy, a Cree leader alongside his family. The portrait, made in a time of federal pressures and land disputes, shows household arrangements, gender roles, and authority, revealing how leadership was tied to everyday life in Cree communities of that period. Record from 1901. Buffalo Bill posing with Pawnee and Lakota performers and chiefs, from left to right. Brave Chief, Eagle Chief, Knife Chief, Young Chief, Buffalo Bill, American Horse, Rocky Bear, Flies Above, and Long Wolf. Photograph taken at Colonel Fred Cummins' Indian Congress during the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, United States. In the 1880s, in the territory of New Mexico, a woman of the Taos Pueblo people faces the camera. The record shows dark wool on the body, a mantle thrown over the shoulders, turquoise necklaces, and a hairstyle proper to tradition. In the background, the adobe houses point to communal life. On the face, the everyday guided by rituals, exchanges, and the rhythm of the harvests. In 1890, an image was taken of Eddie Gray, heir of White Elk, a member of the Northern Cheyenne. The portrait comes from the post-Plains Wars transition period, when the nation, speakers of an Algonquian language and allies of the Lakota, lived under the reservation system. Their ritual practices and social organization shaped trade networks and boundaries in the upper Missouri. Record of a dance hall in the so-called Summer Garden in Santa Fe, territory of New Mexico, around 1883. The photograph by Ben Wittick documents urban leisure practices on the frontier, with public dances that brought together merchants, workers, and soldiers to the sound of local bands, in a seasonal pavilion open to the public. In the 1880s, Marcia Pascal, of Cherokee descent and daughter of U.S. Army officer George Pascal, travels a country in transformation. In the wake of the Civil War, the march westward, the railroads and the redefinition of laws reshaped the Indian Territory and mixed communities, shaping her choices and the reach of her voice. In 1883, a photograph recorded Two Moons, a prominent Cheyenne leader. Among neighboring peoples were the Apsaluk, known as the Crow, with a strong presence in the northwestern United States. Their collective life relied on rituals, oral transmission, horsemanship, and craftwork, foundations that continue to shape the group's identity. Sioux chiefs portrayed in 1905 by Edward S. Curtis. The image is part of his project to document the indigenous peoples of North America. In it, Lakota Dakota leaders pose in ceremonial attire, signaling status and alliances. The record occurs during a phase of strong federal pressure for assimilation and territorial restriction, after the Plains Wars at the end of the 19th century. In 1894, a Kiowa woman lives in the former Indian Territory, today Oklahoma. After the Plains Wars and the creation of borders, her people were undergoing changes that affected the economy and the sacred. Ceremonies hesitated, the language contracted, family roles shifted. What once rested on regional alliances now had to seek a new balance. In 1926, Miss Jessie Jim, a member and spokesperson of the Chelan, was photographed on the terrace of the Davenport Hotel in Spokane, Washington. The image places an indigenous woman of the Northwest in the urban setting of the post-World War I era. The Chelan from the Columbia River Valley maintained fishing, seasonal rituals, and trade networks despite pressure from federal policies. Innocence, Umatilla Girl, 1910. Portrait by Edward S. Curtis, part of the North American Indian. Made amid assimilation policies in the United States, it records ways of life of the Northwest. The Umatilla live on the Columbia Plateau in the Confederated Tribes. The pose and clothing reveal the photographer's choices, more ethnographic than spontaneous. United States, 1900. A young indigenous woman appears in ceremonial attire of her nation. On the threshold of the 20th century, Native peoples face losses of territory and changes in autonomy. In this setting, dress speaks loudly. Each garment and adornment reaffirms belonging and continuity, a gesture of resistance that crosses time and confronts modernization. Around 1925, an image was taken of Luciania, also called Songbird, and Tessie Mobley, an artist of Euro-American and Chickasaw heritage. The portrait belongs to a moment of native affirmation. The Chickasaw, one of the 5 civilized tribes, originally from the southeastern U.S., preserve languages, clans, and institutions despite the forced relocations of the 19th century. In 1905, on the then-called Flathead Indian Reservation in western Montana, Antoine Moyes, known as Grizzly Door, and Michael pose for a record that documents indigenous presence during the consolidation of federal policies over tribal lands. The image fixes ways of dress and identities at a moment of transition for the Salish and Kootenai. In 1899, the photographer Frank Reinhardt recorded Hattie Tom, an Apache woman. The image appears at the end of the 19th century, when the American West was reorganizing and Native peoples were negotiating new civil powers. In the framing, adornments, and posture, one sees a conscious gesture to assert one's own origin and choose how to appear to the world amid tensions and continuities. In 1880, a hunter from the Crow Nation was photographed in Montana, capturing a moment of transition on the plains. Hunting, central to both the economy and the ritual calendar, provided food, hides, and prestige. The act also shaped relationships with spirits and territories, linking clan, season, and movement to the landscapes that sustained Crow life. Garden of the Gods, Colorado, c. 1900. Record by photographer H.S. Poley. The set of sandstone formations near Colorado Springs was already attracting visitors and scholars at the end of the 19th century, in an area used by the Ute Native peoples. The image, likely a glass plate negative, accompanies the expansion of tourism and railroad transportation on the Front Range. Elsie Vance Chestuan, of the Chickasaw branch, enters the Apache history of the Southwest at the end of the 19th century. Amid campaigns and forced marches, the clans maintained kinship ties, alliances, and paths of subsistence. Her name summons memories of imprisonments, removals, and tense coexistence with army posts on the Mexico-United States border. In 1904, in Taos Pueblo, New Mexico, a photograph captured a local craftsman dedicated to making arrows. The image comes from a time of growing contact between ethnographers and native peoples. Taos Pueblo, inhabited continuously for centuries, is one of the oldest Native American settlements in the U.S., preserving techniques, rituals, and language. Little Wound Oglala Sioux Chief, portrayed between 1870 and 1890 by photographer C.M. Bell in his studio. The image records a leader active in negotiations with United States authorities after the Sioux Wars, displaying elements of ceremonial dress. The portrait is part of the set of ethnographic photographs from the late 19th century. In 1886, Lizzie Longwolf appears in the arena of Buffalo Bill's show. The Wild West tours where she performs helped fix in the imagination the idea of the frontier. On stage, rides, trick shooting, and choreographed numbers combine to transform scattered episodes into a narrative of the West, ready to sell. At the beginning of the 20th century in Montana, a photograph recorded a gathering of members of the Crow Nation, Apsaluk. The scene shows family ties and social networks, visible in postures, clothing, and objects. More than just a portrait, the image documents everyday practices and traditions that shaped community life during that period. Tutuk Peaches, also known as Gives to the Poor and Prairie Chicken, was a member of the Pawnee Nation. In 1868, he served as a tribal policeman and a scout hired by the United States Army on the Central Plains, amid the conflicts of the period. The nicknames appear in ethnographic records. Photo by William Henry Jackson, 1868, 19th century. In 1895, a photograph records a young Hopi, a Pueblo people of the mesas of Arizona. Her clothing and adornments reveal family and stage of life. While the end of the 19th century brought railroads, merchants, and researchers, the community's calendar remained paced by seasonal ceremonies that sustained bonds and meanings in collective daily life. In 1926, a photograph captured Alice Gary, a resident of the Coeur d'Alene Reservation in northern Idaho. A descendant of Ignace Hayden Gary and Suzette Josephine Rivet, she was part of a family lineage. The image, taken during a phase of documenting Native peoples, points to the intergenerational transmission of practices and stories that shape Coeur d'Alene history. Ute Man, photographed between 1880 and 1900. Belonging to the native peoples of the Rocky Mountains, he lived through the period of consolidation of reservations and pressure for assimilation. He inhabited the region corresponding today to Colorado and Utah. The portrait records clothing and adornments that combine traditional items and trade materials, evidencing adaptation and cultural continuity. In 1899, Frank Reinhardt records Hattie Tom, a Chiricahua Apache woman. In the ethnographic climate of the century's end, the image invites us to notice adornments, hairstyle, and textiles that reveal the group's techniques and identities. The serenity of the portrait echoes memories of displacement and alliances sealed after the Apache Wars, between memory and survival. In 1916, in Comanche County, Oklahoma, a photograph was taken of Powhatan, also known as Margaret Fisher. Born in 1895, she embodies the intersection of German-American and Comanche worlds. Her father, a German taken prisoner and later adopted by the Comanche Nation, defined a family history marked by encounter and cultural mediation. Record of a Hopi hairstyling specialist, photographed moments before beginning the hair arrangement. Made between 1890 and 1910 by Charles A. Nast, the image is part of the visual collection from the transition period between the 19th and 20th centuries, and documents work practices in the pueblos of the American Southwest in present-day Arizona. In 1886, the photograph portrays Isabel Perico Njadi, a Chickasaw Apache woman held as a prisoner of war. The frame signals the end of the campaigns in the U.S. Southwest. After Geronimo's surrender, the capture of Apache groups intensified. Her presence reveals the impacts of military advance and occupation on indigenous peoples. At the beginning of the 20th century, photographer and ethnographer Walter McClintock captured a Blackfeet camp in Montana, with tipis lined up and horses in the background, symbols of mobility and work. The image was part of a series of glass lantern slides, then used in lectures and classes to document native ways of life under rapid change. A photograph between 1920 and 1930 records Martha Waugh Pear of the Comanche people with her son, George Washington, placed in a cradle board, a traditional cradle used to carry and protect babies. The portrait documents family practices and childcare among the Comanche in the period. The support kept the child secure during travel. George was born on July 4th. Around 1900, the photograph records Alice, possibly linked to the Cayuse, Walla Walla, or Umatilla, peoples of the Columbia Plateau. Her features, clothing, and adornments indicate cultural belonging. The context of the time brought treaties, forced displacements, and new borders in the Pacific Northwest, shaping destinies and memories that the image still evokes. In 1879, at the Rosebud Agency, Sioux leaders gathered to evaluate treaties, the pressure from settlers, and relations with federal agents. Among them were Black Crow, a respected advisor; Two Strike, a chief with a history of campaigns; White Thunder, guardian of rituals; Spotted Tail, mediator in negotiations; and Iron Wing, organizer of the villages. They debated paths for the immediate future. 1864 portrait of Seth Kinman, a California hunter and so-called mountain man. Produced in the context of the Civil War and westward expansion, the record highlights frontier culture, leather clothing, hunting arms, and trophies associated with life in Humboldt County and the supply of hides and meat to settlements. In 1885, the photograph portrays a young Comanche woman. The hairstyle, beads, and fabric reveal artisanal knowledge and commercial exchanges in the southern Great Plains. It is a time after the collapse of the bison and the imposition of fixed territories, changes that redirected movements, dress, and forms of sustenance for the people. The scene condenses a historical turning point. In 1901, in the state of Montana, a photograph shows Duncan MacDonald with his wife. A member of the Flathead people, he appears in everyday clothing, with a typical Northwestern setting in the background. The image captures a simple moment and at the same time documents family relations and ways of life, showing the role of photography in preserving memories and identities. Record of a medicine lodge in winter, a ceremonial structure used by the peoples of the Great Plains. Siksika, Blackfoot men, appear in front of the structure in a moment of community life. The image was captured in 1912 by Roland Reed, when state control over ritual practices was increasing, serving as a visual source for historical studies of Siksika culture. In 1900, a photograph records a young Hopi woman on her wedding day. The frame reveals rituals that brought families and clans together in the villages of the Arizona Plateau. Textiles and shell and turquoise ornaments speak of crafts passed down. The hairstyle and the pieces offered an ounce entry into adult life and uphold the continuity of the people. Helen, known by her tribal name Goes Ahead Hogan, was photographed shortly before her death in 1925. A member of the Crow Nation, she lived on the Crow Reservation in southern Montana. The image documents the final stage of her life and highlights the importance of safeguarding Native narratives to ensure their transmission to future generations. Men pose on and inside a horse-drawn stagecoach in Boulder County, Colorado, 1898. The scene records the everyday use of animal-drawn transportation at the end of the 19th century, when the city was consolidating commercial and mail routes between local mines and the urban centers of the Front Range. Record possibly of a commercial nature. In the 1886 photograph, Julie Nelson appears aligned with the social codes of the late 19th century. Attire, hairstyle, and posture communicate the pursuit of respectability amid urbanization and industrial advance. The direct gaze and calculated pose suggest control and self-awareness before the camera, a mirror of new forms of visibility and transformation and of status. In 1906, on the Crow Reservation in southern Montana, a photograph was taken of Hannah Morrison, born in 1882. Daughter of Alva James Morrison, a white man and a Crow woman, she exemplifies interethnic unions within the context of federal assimilation policies. The image became part of collections and stands as a reference to contact between communities in the West. Harry with Horns, Sioux Lakota boy, portrayed in the late 1890s on the Rosebud Reservation, South Dakota. The image, made by Jesse H. Bratley, records Indigenous youth during a period of social reorganization of the Plains Nations, under federal policies of assimilation and territorial control after the wars of the 19th century. In 1895, George A. Addison paints Amy and Carrie Kiowa. On the namesake island off South Carolina, two figures occupy the scene. In the post-Reconstruction era, when the barrier islands combined fishing and cotton, clothing, postures, and objects reveal routines guided by tides and coastal exchanges, in a record that brings matter, labor, and landscape closer. In 1905, Geronimo, a Chickasaw Apache leader, remained a prisoner of war at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where he had lived since 1894. He paraded at Theodore Roosevelt's inauguration in Washington, the federal capital, and asked for authorization to return to Arizona. It was refused. In the same year, he dictated his autobiography to S.M. Barrett, published in 1906. In the 1880s, it was the young Comanche women who kept life in motion. They prepared food, set up and moved camps, worked leather and brokered exchanges, sustaining mobile networks tied to buffalo hunting and trade. By teaching languages, songs, and rituals, they wove kinship and alliances, preserving traditions in a time of change on the plains. Charging Bear, Mattawatakpi, a member of the Sioux Nation, Western Dakota branch. Recorded in Yankton, March 1905. The reference corresponds to a period notation that identifies the person and the ethnic group, placing them at the Yankton Reservation at the beginning of the 20th century, when administrative and photographic surveys sought to catalog leaders and families. Montana, 1912. Piegan, Picooney, man and woman, a people of the Blackfeet Confederacy, pose in front of a teepee erected on the edge of a cliff overlooking a river. The image, documentary in nature, was captured and later hand-colored by Roland W. Reed and Johannes Anderson, reflecting ethnographic recording practices of the early 20th century. Mother and Child Ute People, c. 1893. Photograph by J.A. Boston. The image records a family unit in a phase of adaptation after the imposition of reservations in Colorado and Utah. The framing highlights everyday clothing and trade items, serving as a source to study material patterns and relations between photographers and indigenous communities at the end of the 19th century.